It's a two-camera approach.
There's real one as well.
There's real one.
Oh my god, I can feel that on my leg. That's nice getting to know stuff. Great.
It's kind of good to be out now.
Reminds that.
Yeah, the car park's okay. Wine in the car park is fine. Okay, we're going to talk to the boy.
On that side, not this side. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah.
I can only have scripted conversations with my son. Yes? You're my .4 child. Sometimes in my youth, I heard a statistic that the average family had 2.4 children. I was young and imaginative, and I formed a literal mental image of 2.4 children, and the part of the image that is you stayed with me, and grew in me, and haunted me.
What did the image look like?
It didn't look like a child cut nearly up the middle, or across the waist anyway. It wasn't a neat 60% shaded infographic type image that you might imagine being used. It was more like a child who could only be looked at from certain angles, or who started to kind of escape and dematerialize the instant I looked directly at it.
Why was I born?
You were born because ever since I stopped being a child, I had a hole in my heart that I kept open for children of my own. Keeping that hole open caused me pain, but I kept doing it, and that pain took a shape, and it wasn't the exact same shape as the hole.
How was I born?
You gestated in the hole in my heart, and I birthed you here in the museum. And you emerged from the building materials I saw around me, because your voice echoed around in my head when this room was empty, and it didn't sound exactly like me. And I guess I was so tired of dragging more of me out of me that I just wanted to give birth to something else.
What am I supporting?
You are supporting a sub-story of the Bachelor Pad Museum.
What am I made of?
You're made of spare material from the statistical and building industries. The statistical material has been industrially processed into images and desires. I worked in this particular construction industry for a time, at the very bottom of the ladder, processing raw materials on the factory floor. So I know how it's done to some extent. I made the materials from which more educated people built grand edifices. Basically, I phoned people up and got them to take surveys. And I broke down their resistance to being commodified, and then broke their opinions and thoughts and desires into numerical values, discrete points on a scale, pre-written responses, and so on. And I needed their complex vacillations, their misunderstandings, their acerbic jokes, moments of resistance, whatever, fed them all through an extruder like spaghetti. And then once I'd squeezed and refined and cajoled their consciousness into forms, and once I'd expressed everything from them and put them in the proper forms, I sent their processed expressions onto other people, like analysts, economists, project managers, translators, whatever. Basically, people who mostly weren't working for €9 an hour and a shared computer and a 0 hours contract. People who didn't need to know, and for the sake of the objectivity of the study, couldn't know, what peculiar and resistant things were proper to each respondent's speech. So they couldn't even afford to differentiate the respondents. They had to kind of perceive their responses as one big substance that they cut back up into person-sized pieces. And then they could read trends and determine averages and make informed predictions. They could form conclusions like that the average family has 2.4 children, which were fully intended to act as norms. And they could tell us what we were all nearly like, but what none of us was quite like. So they make outsiders of us all. And we're all part of the remainder of their equation. So you were constructed from scraps of other people's lives that were assembled into a monstrous image. A collage of reports mixed with a biological imperative and transformed into a desire. You're the result of the constant recasting and reusing of cultural forms. A questionnaire like the one scripting our conversation is a kind of form. A form here is something you fill in with information to create data and projections out of funneled subjectivity. The usually wooden mould that concrete is poured into on a building site is another kind of form. The larger structure shaping a piece of cast concrete is referred to as formwork. The process of removing this structure to see what you've created is called striking the form. It's a process of unpacking the form to see what object you've contributed to the culture. I think it's usually a fairly nerve-wracking moment for architects and builders. When I go to fill in an online form, my computer often anticipates it. After I write in one piece of information, the other boxes go yellow and suddenly have information in them too. And often the computer makes a wrong call and assumes this is an identical form to one that's filled in before when it isn't. I have to correct it. But I always find myself feeling kind of, that I appreciate the effort, despite being a little bit creeped out by the reminder of how much of what makes me who I am is manifested by this information that my computer assumes it knows. Anyway, established forms are used to mediate between the general and the particular, to make some kind of compromise that's acceptable to people who want to live in a networked society. So yeah, you're a bit of someone else's kid, or many parts of many other people's kids. There's no way to know. And I, the Bachelor, am like this too. A loose figure made out of all the wrong parts of a person. And so you came to me rattling on my thoughts, gestating for a long and difficult term. I birthed you here in the flat, as I say, from the building materials, because your voice echoed in my head. And your shape took negative form in my heart. And when I came to terms with you, you took form as a term, or a terminal figure. It's a half man, half column from the classical architectural tradition. So yeah, you're not made from my genetic material, but you're my point 4 child.
Was I planned?
That's not entirely easy to say. Certainly once I became conscious of wanting you, I started to make designs on what you would be like. But whether I planned to want you, I don't know. The process of desiring something is figured out through desiring it. This is the process of arriving at intentionality, and this is something like what we call planning. I began to make drawings and models of what you might look like, how you might interact with, and support the structures around you. We model the future to get a sense of it for ourselves and to communicate it to others. We work to scale so that we can stay within our means until we're sure. We can master our creations and they won't do anything we don't anticipate. Scale models of things are little versions of themselves, like a child is a little version of their parents or their future self. And like a child, they're not always obedient to their design intentions. For the most part, I make things 1/10 their actual size, although for the most part I never intend to actually scale them up to their actual size. They're meant to dwell on possibility, like the Emily Dickinson poem that's over at the back there. I'm not sure if I can get a clear line of sight for you, but it's in the, can you see it? It's in the White House at the back. Anyway, over here is a model. This one is a model that I made of you and me talking. And as you can see here, hold on, I have to get this. Yeah, you're like a more filled out version of yourself. You're not just a drawing of yourself, you're a 3-dimensional kind of wedge. And this is the term, the Greek thing. And as you can see, you're also in this one like halfway between the top and bottom mezzanine rather than under the bottom mezzanine. So it's a little different. Over here is a more kind of theatrical one. It was made as if it was like a full stage set with choreographic markings on the floor. That didn't happen either. And then right at the back there is, again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the eye line for you here, it's a bit of a tricky angle. There's like a brown cardboard one that is where your head just pokes out of a larger mezzanine and you're like the whole structure is your body. Anyway, none of these scale models are you, or even an implementable kind of plan for you. But when I began to make you in your current form, I intended to build formwork around you and pour concrete or plaster in. You just have the flat head sticking out. But the form you take now, even though it's only intended to be a drawing, when I stepped back and looked at it, I was kind of struck how it hovered between the virtual and the actual. You dwelt in this kind of messier and more profound kind of possibility. So you were a plan for yourself, but you did something I wasn't expecting, and I liked it.
Do you love me?
Yeah, of course I do.
Are there others like me?
Not exactly. A human being with a womb can be a surrogate bearer for a child that's not their own genetic material, like Phoebe did on Friends. Male-bodied seahorses carry the young, following a dance that most humans probably wouldn't recognise as erotic. They give birth to squillions of babies at a time, and it looks like the dad is ejaculating out of a vagina in his stomach. The Greek god Zeus swallowed a woman called Metis to stop her reproducing, and then a while later he had a really bad headache, so he cracked his skull open on a rock, and the goddess Athena leapt out, fully grown in full armour, and then she was regarded as his daughter. There's a genre of internet fan fiction called mpreg, about male characters getting pregnant from gay relationships. I think I vaguely remember a 90s film in which Arnold Schwarzenegger was pregnant. And I mean, obviously then, like, not everyone with a womb identifies as a woman, so the idea of a man gestating a child isn't exactly novel, but the process by which I've done it is a bit weird. And even if these beings are a bit like me, I suppose that doesn't necessarily mean that their offspring are like you.
Am I special?
You're special.
Where is the end of me?
I don't know where you end and the room begins.
Does that make me weird?
Not really. You're certainly more architectural than me, or anyone else I know. But I think the uncertainty about boundaries is common to everyone. We all spread out into and across the surface of the spaces we occupy. They form us and we leave our traces on them. For example, whenever I finally get around to washing my bed sheets, I always notice this shape that's only slightly larger than my body, and faint yellow outline on the white cloth. I guess it's mostly the residue of a mulch made of dead skin cells that's suspended in semen and sweat and whatever the eczema ooze is composed of. So, my genetic material, essentially. I lie folded in this envelope of myself, transferring parts of myself into my bed while I sleep. It's like a gestural drawing made over many nights. And how small it is kind of always makes me feel a little bit tender towards myself, like makes me able to see how limited and jittery my tosses and turns must be, confined to this narrow corridor of a quite large surface. Because I sleep alone, but I guess I must always just stay on one side and keep the other side open.
Is that still my sibling?
No. It's too directly narcissistic. And the parts of me that it's made out of are dead anyway. I think a child is always a subversive narcissism. Like it's meant to be made in your image and continue your legacy, but 9 times out of 10 it goes astray. And I guess that's why patriarchy involves such kind of brutal and polyvalent policing of what's proper, because it has the system to reproduce its power relations, but it has an incredibly high inbuilt failure rate, like seemingly way higher than the anticipated entropy of any given system. So people crack down on their stray children from all these angles until they bring them back into line and make them into adults who do what they're supposed to.
Why am I here?
Because I have the desire or the fantasy, and for now I have the space. Like the space to dwell in and with possibility and with multiple possibilities all at once. The possibilities sit in the space, but they also constitute the space. So you materialize here spatially, being and taking up space.
Why did you make me this way?
Well, when we look at spaces and objects designed to accommodate people and their bodies, we obviously also look at a set of materialized assumptions about people and bodies. Le Corbusier, for example, had this figure called the modular, which was supposed to be a universal measure for building design based on the human figure. It takes the size of an average man as 183 centimeters, but then it figures him with his arm raised and draws a lot of lines all over him based on mathsy stuff. Which comes out as this kind of loopy drawing of a man set in a rectangle that's around 226 by 113 centimeters, which isn't far off the size of a standard cut sheet of any material you get in a builder's shop, which is 244 by 122 centimeters. And that's a measurement in combination with the size of my own body, which has to varying degrees of consciousness been the one I've ordered all the furniture and architecture, sculpture type things I've ever made around. Meaning I kind of operate with this perverted modular, like objects which really describe the relationship of my changing, fallible, non-average body to a practical industrial standard.
Well, what happened to me? When you died?
In the classic notion of patrilineality, the male child is both the legacy and the inheritor of the legacy. So he's expected to live up to his father's name by managing his assets, to be both the father's creation and the father's continuation. The House Museum offers a little bit of a curious alternative for men whose children are disappointing or illegitimate or non-existent. It allows the public man to institutionalize his private life. Children are discounted or disinherited, and yet the man's name and legacy are secured. The man turns himself inside out, and in the process of exposing the private becomes pure public. I don't think there's any kind of vulnerability in this maneuver. It's like this exposure that insists there's nothing to expose. So the family man dissolves into institutional knowledge. And the way that this knowledge is stratified means this alternative form of patrilineality doesn't actually change anything about its function as reproducer of class relations, except maybe makes them slightly more ideal. But I don't know how that's affected by the peculiarities of our situation, since I don't actually own this house, and you're now physically part of its architecture.
What do you want from me?
Suppose I want you to do me proud by rebelling against me. I don't know, I'm not sure if we really understand ever why we make what we make, or just how we relate to the bodies we surround ourselves with, or the worlds we build. Let me try and tell you a story. There once lived an architect named John Soane. He was the most famous architect of his day, which was a long time ago now. He designed banks and galleries and great houses for the wealthy. But nearly all of them would crumble and be forgotten, even before I was born. What Soane would be remembered for is his own house, which he bequeathed to the public when he died, because he didn't know what else to do with it. So that means anyone can go there now. And it was while I walked around this house, with you inside me, that I first really began to feel you kick. Now, this house isn't big and sensible and solid, like all the banks and public buildings. This house is a tightly wound maze, full of moving walls and secret passages. And more than anything else, this house is absolutely encrusted with body parts. He collected them from around the world, chipping them off temples and casting them off friezes, or buying them from the collections of other rich English people. As you move towards the back of the house, the corridors you walk down become tighter, and the walls on either side more and more densely covered in fragments of ancient statues. A foot here, now a corner of a face, over here 3 little men. Sometimes they're arranged quite formally, the exploded body parts coming back together into some kind of recognisable assemblage. Sometimes they're scattered more obscurely. It would take a lifetime to parse or imagine every possible narrative suggested by their composition. But a lifetime is what Son had. A lifetime of arrangement and rearrangement. This back part of the house was made for his architectural pupils, his army of charges, little versions of himself, a legacy. Son was a bricklayer's son who took his grand tour using a grant from the king. He did not assume that his students would all come from wealth or have the luxury of patronage, so he gathered and collected architectural elements from Italy, Greece and Egypt. They could do their grand tour by walking across the house. Now this architect also had two genetic sons, who were a grave disappointment to him. Son wanted to build important public buildings, but he also wanted to build an architectural legacy of another kind. His great dream was to establish a dynasty, to fix the association of the name Son to architecture, not just through his buildings, but through his sons taking up his mantle. This was common practice at the time, and it remains so today, if not so much in architecture, at least in other professions like law and real estate. Neither of his sons became architects, although he sent them off for training. The elder, John Jr., was sickly, married disadvantageously, and died young. The younger, George, gambled, wrote bad prose, and ended up in prison. It was when John Jr., the son who eventually died, started to make it clear that he would not be becoming an architect, that Son shifted his focus to turning his house into a complex, inside-out, public-private space. And this focus would sharpen noticeably with each of the tragedies that followed. It was this second son, the son who survived, who would become Son's great nemesis. Enraged that his parents wouldn't bail out his debts, he turned his awful anger to his father's work. He wrote an article, published anonymously, criticising him and his house. When she read it, Son's beloved wife Eliza declared, "George has written this. These are my death blows." And true enough, she was dead within a month. From this moment on, George was also dead to his father. Scale never sits still in Son's house. The entire breakfast room turns out to be a scale model for a dome in his design for the Bank of England. His private life played out under a miniaturised parody of his most famous public work. Larger-than-life sculptures sit in concert with miniature friezes, dwarfing and threatening to gobble them up. Two broken feet off a statue flank a fragment of cornice. The columns supporting the students' mezzanine are a scaled-down wooden replica of a Greek colonnade, making giants of the nervous youths walking under them. The house is a warren, a game of scale stuffed with smaller games of scale. One of his assistants described it as a conglomerate of vast ideas in little. Moving through this labyrinth of twisting bodies, broken ideal forms, you're never able to settle fully into familiar assumptions about the scale and limitations of your own soft and hard and difficult self. At the very back of the very basement lies what Son called the Egyptian crypt, full of artefacts which the curator of the house says have a lugubrious character. That means sad. The basement is roofless, opening onto the galleries of a double-height room above it, lit with an enormous skylight. The floors of these galleries are also punctured with grills, so in this deepest, darkest basement, sunlight still stabs unpredictably in. Chief among the lugubrious artefacts is the sarcophagus of King Seti I of Egypt, the most extravagant object in Son's collection. He bought it in 1824, 9 years after his wife died, and 1 year after his son did. That's about 200 years ago now, if you can imagine. By this stage, the widowed Son had begun to open his house to the public. Allegedly, when receiving guests, he used to lie and wait for them inside the sarcophagus, sitting up out of it to cheerfully greet them when the servants showed them in. The Egyptian sarcophagus is propped up on fragments of Greek columns, and nowadays is displayed under a Victorian-era cage made of glass and steel. A condensed historical collage, technologies of death and preservation and observation. A little way across in a nook that also punctures the basement ceiling and looks up to the skylight, Son displayed a copy of his wife's tomb inscription. I wept when I read it, a witty and moving poem bursting with love. Above it is a smaller perfunctory plaque devoted to the memory of John Jr. I did not weep when I read that. Standing in the basement of Son's house, among these broken fragments, a idealised human forms whirling around the walls surrounding an empty sarcophagus, felt an overwhelming sense of displaced grief. This attempt to stitch together an inherently imperfect creature seemed to resonate with the pain of failure, of a failed lineage and the frustrations of love. Thought of my own life and what any of these complex stories mean if we have no one to leave them to. Then I felt you kicking in the hole in my heart. For some, these plaster casts and relics had an alibi. They were travel souvenirs, or maybe more accurately, a three-dimensional slideshow for the benefit of his pupils. But unlike the digital questionnaire, the House Museum is a forum that allows unspoken sentiments to flourish rather than flipping them off. The interconnected spaces seem to hold each other, like the nested scales of house and representation, or a parent gently rocking her child. The image was reversed, which made my father look sort of grotesque on first glance. I placed the plastic plate over the printout and carefully taped it down, lining the corners up perfectly. I hadn't done this in about 10 years. I had no memory of how deep to cut or how much control I would have over the stylus. I began to scratch, starting with his hair as I felt it would be forgiving of mistakes. Once I reached the point where it touches his ears, I was led naturally out onto the arm of his glasses. Here, there was no room for error. I didn't make one. For the first few minutes of scratching his face in, I couldn't figure out a way to see what I was doing properly. My scratches weren't visible over the lines and shadows of the photograph. Then I discovered that I could lower and tilt my head so that I looked across the surface of the plate towards the light of the window. The glare on the surface occluded the image underneath, meaning I could now see my own drawing. I could see my father's young face, just a few years older than I am now. Despite the inescapable whack of photorealism, something of my drawing style has come through, in my lines I guess, and my choices of which areas to emphasise. When I reached myself, I was unsure how to proceed. There's not much that is recognisable as face in the squashed lump emerging from folds of blankets in his arms. I scratched in cross-hatched patches of shade, tracing the outlines of wrinkles around and I guess constituting my eyes. I scratched the lines that make up my little newborn head, my raisiny fingers. When I performed the head tilt check, I was surprised to find that much of the impression of a baby comes across from my hesitant thicket of lines. I'm like a little seed in his arms, a ball of compacted flesh that already contains all the strangely encoded information it needs to grow into a being that looks almost exactly like him, only slightly off, like my uncertain scratches over this flipped photograph, an uncanny representation of him, an imprint, a continuation, a parody. In George Soane's critical article about his father's work, the one that killed his mother, he wrote at the house at Lincoln's Inn Fields, "It seems as if it were intended to convey a satire upon himself. It looks like a record of the departed. It can only mean he has reared this mausoleum for the confinement of his body." After his wife died, Soane framed the article and hung it on the breakfast room wall over a plaque stating, "Death blows delivered by George Soane." This too he showed off to his museum visitors. In 1833, John Soane, old and feeble, and by now a peer of the House of Lords, passed a Special Act of Parliament, determining that his house would always be free and open to the public. He was manoeuvring a new vessel for his representation in the world to come, now that his sons had proven insufficient. 2 years later, he was honoured by the Architects of England with a gala dinner, which he was too frail to attend. In his place, he sent a marble bust of his head, made by Francis Chantry. Another 2 years later, he was dead. The bust stands at the centre of his museum. The lump of rock made in the stead of his head is the anchor point of his mind map, his diagram of the body in space. Soane treated representation as a medium of mourning, as a form of projection, and as a means to exercise control. You're something I made in my own image, part of the world my generation generated. But you must be the architect of the world to come, the world you will inhabit. You will represent me in that world, more or less as you are now. But what you mean is not up to me anymore.